views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Last month, former police officer Derek Chauvin was convicted on all the charges for the murder of George Floyd. But incredibly, the very next day, a Virginia man named Isaiah Brown was on the phone with 911 Police Dispatch when a sheriff's deputy shot him 10 times, allegedly mistaking the phone for a gun. And as you all know, there were other subsequent incidents as well. This keeps happening in America. Why does it happen? Is it poor training, poor application of tactics, fundamental racism, all of the above? And of course, how do we address the inequities that show that more than 6,200 people have been shot by police since 2015, and Black Americans are shot at a disproportionate rate? They account for less than 13% of the U.S. population, but are killed by police at more than twice the rate of other Americans. Hispanic Americans, by the way, are also killed by police at a disproportionate rate. Tonight, we have an excellent expert panel to review the whys and hopefully offer some solutions. So let's start off by welcoming the congressman from New York's 16th Congressional District, Representative Jamaal Bowman. Congressman Bowman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
A professor from the doctoral program at the John Jay College College of Criminal Justice and the CUNY Graduate Center. It is Professor Candace McCoy. Thank you, Professor McCoy, for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
And a retired NYPD detective and professor of emergency and disaster management at Metropolitan College of New York. He's also vice president of the security at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It is Dr. Oscar Odom. And so, Dr. Odom, nice to have you with us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
We will also be joined as soon as he gets free from the 36th Senatorial District. He's the chair of the New York State Senate's Codes Committee, and that is Senator Jamaal Bailey. Okay, he will be joining us in a bit. Let's start with you, Congressman Bowman. This is a very difficult problem. We have many terrible situations that have happened. It has riled up communities across America, and it keeps happening. I guess two-part question: why, and then what are you hoping to do in Congress to help address this and put some sense into our policing?
Well, it happens because of racism, both explicit and implicit, both conscious and unconscious. It happens because of bias, again, explicit and implicit, not only at the individual level, but at the structural level, at the department level, at the national level. Unfortunately, it seems we continue to have police officers working in our stations who carry this bias and seem to carry a fear of Black and brown skin. And police are trained to kill. And when they approach a situation where there is some of that fear, they shoot first and ask questions later. You know, this is why we have to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act as the floor, not the ceiling. There's a lot more we need to do around criminal justice reform. You know, the BREATHE Act proposed by the Movement for Black Lives is very important, as well as Ayanna Presley's People's Justice Guarantee. So, you know, we got to deal with issues also related to public safety and public health in our communities, issues of dilapidated and neglected housing, issues of food insecurity, issues of lack of jobs, issues of underfunded schools. These are holistic problems that haven't been solved by our elected officials or corporate America for that matter. Instead, we bring in more police, we overly police communities, and we still have a system and a mindset in this country of explicit and implicit racism.
Aside from the specifics of tactics and training and all some of the things you mentioned, from your perspective, is it appropriate for the federal government to put out this legislation? Is that the most effective way to deal with this? Or are we really need to go to municipalities all across the country and say, this is how you do it, this is how you do it, you know what I mean? Because each of the municipalities have their own personalities, they have their own attitudes towards race, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, holistic problems require collaborative solutions, right? So there needs to be a federal, state, county, and local city municipality solution. I mean, there's been studies that have shown the connection between local police departments and white nationalist individuals and organizations. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies have this data. That's one of the reasons why we introduced the COO Act to look at connections between Capitol Police and white nationalist organizations, as well as the FBI, Secret Service, and Department of Homeland Security. So it has to be a collaborative approach. It can't just be federal legislation, which is helpful. I've heard from local law enforcement officials that if they were able to hold police accountable, if certain police were held accountable at the federal level, it would make their job easier, because the idea of policing yourself, if you will, hasn't gone very far, doesn't work. We continue to see police officers not held accountable for that action. So I think a federal hand in this is going to be very important as well.
Your final question, sir, and I know you've got to get back to work, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us. How do you change people's minds? I mean, we talk about racism, and that goes deep, embedded in some places in this country. It's part of the culture, frankly, and that's reflected in some of these overly aggressive incidents. How do you change people's minds? Is that done legislatively? There is a huge pushback on people who look for equality because they say, well, wait a minute, you're really the problem, not the solution. So how do you change people's minds? How do we get to that germ that's causing this bacteria, if you will?
It's done through education in our public schools and through our public school system. You know, we've all gone through the public school system, and both, again, explicitly and implicitly, we learn that white is superior, Black is inferior. We learn this through the authors we read in our public schools, the heroes we celebrate in our public schools, the history we tend to focus on, and the history we tend to ignore. What we learn about Black people in this country, you know, I learned in school that my history started with slavery. It was outside of school that I actually learned that I came from a beautiful continent with amazing resources that had civilizations prior to European invasion. So if we change our education system, make it more multicultural, make it more diverse, that's a key piece. Another key piece is we have been segregated in our communities for far too long. We should be living together, we should be going to school together, and we should be learning about each other. And that will help us to make sure the next generation, the future generations, aren't inflicted with this disease of racism and bias.
I guess I should have known that would be your answer, considering that you're a former school principal. So I know how you look at the world and what you think we ought to be doing, Congressman. Thank you so much for joining us and kind of setting the tone for this discussion this evening. And certainly, if you can stick around, do it. If not, we understand certainly that it's always a busy day in Washington, D.C.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.
All right. So now I think we need to right away throw it to you, Professor McCoy. I know you have strong feelings about legislation, what the effectiveness of it might be, and where it ought to come from. So let's go to you, Professor McCoy, and talk about what you heard from the congressman.
Well, I think the congressman's statements are very good and accurate regarding the need to get at deep-seated change. He mentioned the difference between individual problems and structural racism, the difference between getting an individual bad apple officer off the streets versus deep-seated structural change within the entire barrel, which is the police department itself. So legislation aimed at this is all to the good. However, I'd say that regarding the federal role, what the congressman said is good. You know, in the old-fashioned way, it couldn't hoit. But the Daniel Patrick Moynihan was probably right on this one. Most politics is local. The George Floyd Act proposed in Congress right now, which it looks great and it's good as far as it goes, but the federal government can't go that far. This will, like getting rid of qualified immunity, for instance, is part of that act, and that will apply basically to federal FBI agents. Good as far as it goes, but it can't go far enough. What we need to do is to look to our city councils and our mayors and the people who can control and guide policing in our own city.
In preparation for this program, some of the interaction you and I had, and you were very clear that in terms of, let's say, the numbers of shootings that we've had, you indicated to me, well, if you really look at it, it's not gone up, it's not gone like this. We just happen to know about it, and that brings up the question of, cameras, cop cameras, and everybody has got one of these in their pockets, and so they can take a picture of anything they see. And media, of course, is a lot stronger in social media. So is that perception helpful, or does it distort the reality?
Maybe both. It does distort the reality of how many fatal encounters there are. In fact, it's held completely steady over the last 5 years that we've got data from the Washington Post. And data before that, going back to the 1960s, indicates that over the last half century, these decades, shootings by police of residents has dropped significantly. And that's because, no doubt, very slowly, incrementally, the courts, the policy changes that are pursued on controlling these matters over time has a difference. But that doesn't make it right, whatever's left. I mean, what is left is still a very high number. And when we look, now we can look at it. The difference is body-worn cameras. All the police departments all over the nation are being required to put up the body-worn cameras, and the footage from these cameras can be reviewed, well as the cell phones.
Let me just interject, and then I definitely want to bring Professor Odom into the equation. The body cameras, the police body cameras are useful, but as we saw in North Carolina right now, they're used as kind of a vehicle through which to not provide any any comfort for anybody or any information. It's being kept as a closed secret. Seems to me that legislation from a national level should require those cameras to be out there. I see you're shaking your head no.
Gary, as somebody who worked as one of the investigators with the Department of Investigation's Inspector General over the NYPD, I can tell you that you don't want to react immediately when an incident has happened. You want to investigate fully. You want all of the evidence, and then you make your statements. If you release these footages too soon, and especially on circumstances where somebody has died in a gruesome way, horrible way, do we really want to keep watching videos, have our children keep bringing the videos up and playing them over and over when we see gruesome deaths it's hard.
Let's bring Dr. Odom in there. I don't know if you, I'm guessing that you have some strong feelings about that. And so we'll let you weigh in on that and bring you into the conversation. What are your thoughts?
I actually wrote about it also in my dissertation about body cameras being recommended for police officers. And being a retired police officer and former commissioner, I realize that it's very important to have this footage because people do have their cameras from their phones. But I think that this is important because it allows transparency. It allows some sort of footage so that you can at least review it to see what was done right, what was done wrong. But then also what goes deeper with this is that when we look at the things, it's the policies that are put in place that also put police officers in this position. And I look at that. I myself, I was born and raised in the Tompkins housing projects in Bedford-Stuyvesant section of New York. So I understand what it's like to be a Black man and also to have encounters with the police department. But what I say is this, is that, say, for example, if you have 40,000 New York City police officers and you require every officer to write a minimum of 25 to 50 summonses per month, you know how many that encounters there are with police officers, with the public for bad things. And you just waiting for something to happen by having 40,000 police officers mandated to write a minimum of 25 to 50 summonses per month. And this was also brought up in the stop, question, and frisk trial. The thing is, this is that you placing them in a position, you forcing them in a position to have these type of encounters. Also, when you look at that, you know how many the number is from the 25 per month times 40,000. Then not only that, there's so many other issues that involve, from mental health issues to different things like that. And you force the police officers to be in this position to do it. Car stops. Do police officers have to do car stops now? No, you have cameras. If you're trying to generate revenue for people running the red lights, you could do that. You can have them set up during stops with DWIs or whatever, but you don't have to have that type of encounter. Certain incidents or interactions that you have with the police, like one of the recent ones where the police officers wound up shooting somebody, was because somebody was on welfare and they didn't show up to work. So you send the police officers to go there and have an encounter. Now the person is dead. So you put the police in this position. Remember, the police work for the public and for the government. If you tell them they not to write summonses, they're not to go there, they're not going there on their own. It's because you put them in those positions to go do those things.
To have that kind of interaction.
Right. And that's forced upon them. And do they need training? There's no doubt about it.
I just want to go back to the question of cameras, and then we'll move on to the other issues that you've raised. Are you comfortable with the judge in North Carolina holding that footage until some later date when the investigation? Or do you say he's got to release that right now and let people see what it is, because it'll at least begin to crystallize what has happened?
Yes, somebody needs to see that footage, the whole footage, no redacted part. Somebody needs to see it. I don't think that the legislature should hold off and say it's going to be 30 days. It's going to be, especially the climate. We have a transparency issue and we have a trust issue with the public now with the police. Somebody needs to see the full footage of it, be that the prosecution and also defense or family members, but somebody needs to see it. Even if it's not on TV for the whole public to see, somebody needs to see the entire thing. Otherwise, it looks like you're holding back something. You're corrupt. They did the wrong thing.
This certainly looks like that's exactly what is going on here. Let's get into this notion of tactics. Now, you say that the pressure to write summonses increases negative interactions with the public. I understand that. I was talking with you before the show, is that you have many of these young police officers, and we thank them for making the commitment to our communities, for being police officers. You put the gun around their belt, you give them various tactical trainings, but you never train them in, let's say, maybe that community is not all that welcoming of the police department. And then this young police officer goes into a community and all of a sudden he thinks he's the big solution and he's being seen as an enemy. Is that the kind of training that we're missing across the country?
We're missing it across the country, but it does that type of training does happen in the police department. In NYPD, they have what they call a social science department, and they teach cultural training and how you deal with certain things inside the community. Here's the issue that happens. I'm also a veteran. One of the things that I look at is that if you put a person in a place where it's considered a high crime area, and there's so much going on, and you stay there imagine, I always say, when I worked in the 7-7 precinct in the early 80s, we average about 30 jobs per sector a day. So imagine if you're going to 30 different incidents per day, from robberies to stabbings to drug deals, and you do that for a period of 3 to 5 years, what impact do you think that has on the police officer and their dealings when they're constantly dealing with that? I always recommended that after 3 to 5 years, cops get rotated. Cops in the Central Park precinct, all they're dealing with is caviar, the Metropolitan ball, and the Guggenheim. There's no stress there except for, did you get the right type of caviar? So the thing is this is that cops in the other areas should get a chance to rotate, to decompress, to deal with these different issues, not constantly there. day in, day out, day in, day out, it has an impact on you also. Remember, police officers are somebody's brothers, fathers, mothers, uncles, brothers, sisters, and nieces. So we have to deal with that too. So they're trained to do that. But just imagine you're in a place, because I can attest to that because I did it. Every day you go, here it is, I'm here. Oh, got a robbery. 10 minutes later, got another robbery. You have this going on. Now you want me to also be the mental health counselor. You want me to do this.
Professor McCoy, tactics, do you want to weigh in on the tactics question?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for the opportunity. I think that we can talk about tactics and we can talk about training. But Professor Odom's points about deployment and also officer mental health, the officer's mental health, and is something that really should be seriously examined. These are things that the department does. These are department policies that need to be looked at very carefully. Now, I would submit that following up on this point about high crime neighborhoods and long periods of being told to be aggressive in these neighborhoods. And that comes from the department, not from the individual officers. Over time, there's one other cause of these shootings that we have to look at, besides the bias, besides the stresses. Quite frankly, what do you need to shoot somebody? You need a gun. And if we really looked carefully and were willing to have the conversation about gun control in this nation, it would reduce the fear, it would reduce the anxiety that makes people make bad decisions. I mean, both police officers and residents who are involved in incidents with them. The fear of police within highly policed neighborhoods that Professor Odom is talking about is really high, obviously. And then you add on the police themselves who are afraid of things going wrong when somebody's going to have a gun and you never know when they do. It makes everybody paranoid and it makes bad decision making. So I know it's a third rail that we haven't been able to touch in this country because of the highly charged political atmosphere about the Second Amendment rights. But if we looked seriously into the problem of guns, it might de-escalate things on all sides.
I've noticed now, I know he was busy all day today, and he's taken a few moments. Senator Jamaal Bailey of the 36th Senatorial District in the Bronx has joined us. Senator, you have leaped into a pretty hot discussion here. I'm going to just lead off with this whole idea now. Mayor de Blasio put together a pilot program that has kept NYPD officers away from many mental health calls. He started it in Harlem and East Harlem, and now he's putting it in place in the larger city. Senator, from your perspective, is this the kind of thing we need to do to begin to address these problems of police shootings in our streets?
Well, one, thank you for having me, Gary, as always, and it's great to be up, having a conversation about something so critical such as policing. And Professor Odom touched on it. Look, I think that we respect officers. We want officers to be able to be placed in positions where they can do the most good, right? And sometimes putting them in situations that would be better served for individuals with other types of training would be better for those officers, one. And it would be better for all of us because there are certain responses that may not require an immediate officer intervention. As we know, and as we've seen, things can escalate in an instant. However, certain calls that are specifically and solely related to mental health concerns, those should be maybe handled by other individuals as opposed to having officers handle those initially. Maybe an officer can be made aware that something is happening so that they can be on the short call in case backup is required. But I think it's important to make sure that we are responding in like kind to individuals. You don't respond you would not respond to a 7-year-old the same way you would respond to a 70-year-old. And, in terms of the response and the nomenclature that you use. That's got to be the same way when we look at situations in our society.
And this borders into this idea of defunding the police. You just went through some serious budget negotiations in the state in order to provide those resources to replace police officers to handle those incidents. Somebody's got to pay for that personnel. Is that the kind of thing that you would say defunding the police is about, or does that money come from somewhere else?
I think when you're talking about budgetary issues, I think that making sure that we can adequately fund all of our city resources is something that is critical to me. Whether it be policing, parks, education, fire, we have to make sure that we're funding everything equitably. I think the response, though, of some officers, depending on the scenario, I think also something that Professor Odom touched on in the brief moments while I had logged on. It comes down to training. It comes down to making sure that officers are placed in a situation that they are well trained for. As attorneys, I'm an attorney by trade, and I have to do something called a CLE, or continuing legal education. I have to certify that I have gone through enough courses in a certain number of areas so that I can maintain my law license. Senator Kevin Parker has a bill, very similar bill, about continuing legal education for police officers, right? Or the comparison. Continuing policing education for police officers. I think that's something critical because, as Professor Odom mentioned, the job changes. I'm 38 years old. I'll be 39 in August, and I can tell you that the 47th precinct in the late 80s and early 90s is way different than the 47th precinct in 2021. It just is. Policing is different. Precision policing is different. The manner in that crimes are solved is different. So we have to make sure that, it's great to be a quote unquote gumshoe that gets by on guile and wit, but we've got to be able to figure out how to teach you how to do certain things in an advanced manner, making no commentary on training police individually, because I've never done it myself.
Senator, thank you very much. Let's get to each of our academic guests, so to speak. Professor Odom, talk to me about the biggest thing that you want to see happen now to begin to address this. My sense was that your thing is in training of police officers. Is that correct? Is that where we got to go?
That's correct. Yes, training, but also requirements for police officers, as stated by the speaker just now. The thing is, what are the metrics? Are you requiring me mandatory in these neighborhoods or any neighborhoods to write a minimum of 50 summonses? Now I have to interact with people over a bad thing. So give me some training, keep me updated on cultural awareness, diversity, interaction, de-escalation training, all those things. And also make sure I don't have to write 50 summonses a month to people in disenfranchised communities, hurting them and causing other interactions. Let somebody else deal with that.
Professor McCoy, let's talk with you about just kind of your final thoughts on what you've heard today and where we ought to go.
Great discussion. I appreciate and agree with what Professor Odom just said. I would also say, though, that we've had all that in place. Well, I'd like to get rid of the summonses part, okay, that
Yes.
quota thing.
Yes.
But the training, the certification, it's all in place. It's already there. We have to do it better. But also, I think we have to realize that there will always be these problems to a certain degree, unless we ask ourselves very carefully, what is the mission of the public police?
We do thank Congressman Jamaal Bowman for joining us earlier. We thank Senator Jamaal Bailey for popping in as soon as he had a few free moments. Professor Candace McCoy from the doctoral program at John Jay, thank you so much. And Dr. Oscar Odom III from Metropolitan College of New York, we thank you as well. And that's it. Exhausting. And we've only just begun this dialogue, I promise you. We'll see you all next week. Thanks to our great producers, Rebecca and Stephen, and our intern is Eitan. And we'll see you next week with more. We got a lot going on. Good.